Suffrage, and freedom from tradition. Matt and Kate's journey to the stars and back is a story filled with characters trying to find the freedom to break from restrictive traditions, of one kind or another. In no particular order, because that takes a great deal more elaboration, Matt seeks freedom from his class's partition in society in order to be free to build his life with Kate. Kate tries to escape the tradition of her class and the expectation of high society ladies to marry for wealth, so she can explore the wondrous natural world, discovering new life in unexpected places. In addition, many other individuals they encounter also have their own dynamic of seeking freedom from an oppressive place of tradition. The easiest example of people seeking freedom from tradition are the women of the suffragette movement, trying to be recognized the right to vote in politics, and fighting against a tradition that sees women as politically irrelevant and only for their use to men. Other examples are actually encountered in the run-up to the space expedition. In the training to become astronauts, Matt meets Tobias, an underwater welder breaking from his grounded roots to reach for the stars, inspired by a little piece of spaceborne rock. The Aeroforce pilots Bronfman and Shepard seem to uphold the tradition of the most dangerous and glamorous jobs and accomplishments going to the best men, the manliest men, until we learn that Shepard is fighting against a medical weakness that would deny him his freedom and literally ground him. Thanks to chronic migraines, his freedom to be the best in the work he finds most fulfilling, flying ornithopters to the limit of performance, would be reduced to him flying a desk. In addition, the photographer and journalist Evelyn Carr maintains her freedom using her prolific success to support herself away from the demands of society to uphold tradition. She's free to maintain a private space where visitors are rare and those unwelcome can be easily driven off. Even the Babylonites, from a twisted point of view, can be said to be seeking freedom from a tradition, although the tradition in question is their society's propensity for expanding technological and scientific development, and the freedom they seek is really to enforce another more archaic kind of tradition, one that's more in line with biblical scripture as dogma. Other characters, in contrast, serve as exemplars of tradition that need to be overcome or bypassed. In opposition to Kate, Evelyn Carr, and the suffragettes, are figures like Sir John Mackinnon, the Canadian Minister of Air, and Sir Hugh Snuffler, the long-venerated zoologist, who both explicitly don't approve of the women of the story being allowed more autonomy and credibility. When Kate commits vandalism with the other suffragettes and is caught and jailed for it, the minister is adamant that she be denied participating in the orbital expedition. It should be no surprise if we can surmise that he represents his government's view of the matter. Snuffler, on the other hand, is a member of the Zoological Society that automatically distrusts any new zoological discovery, and doesn't regard any woman as capable of said scientific discovery. And that includes Kate in particular. Snuffler is exactly the kind of high-placed authority figure that Kate had in mind when driven to collect her biological samples and specimens, because the threat of being discredited permanently on nothing but the questionable word of the rotting old carcass is very real. Meanwhile, Matt's ambition to freely build his relationship with Kate is butting up against a tradition that Kate's parents wish to uphold, echoed in turn by Miss Simpkins in her brief appearance in the story. As far as Kate's parents are concerned, the tradition they must uphold is that their daughter, being born into wealth, must marry into more wealth, within their high society circles. Matt's latent inferiority complex rears its ugly head again when the combination of Simpkins and Kate's parents' apparent warnings against him, and Kate's own plan for them to play down their relationship and avoid suspicion, causes in Matt much distress when he can't openly express his friendship with Kate. Additionally, the thought of a wealthy groom who's willing to indulge Kate in her pursuits also plays into his inferiority complex. Because how can he both make a living as an airship crewman and be there and supportive for Kate as well? Matt also has the experience of his mother and sisters, for how his absence has been hard on them, just as it was when his father was away, until his passing. At least Matt can take heart that his esteemed Captain Walken also had similar experiences and challenges, finding opposition to marrying his wife, as she too was from a wealthy family and above his class, and after finally doing so, causing her and their children much hardship and worry when his career on airships took him into peril and for long absences. The fact that they are still a functional, healthy, and happy relationship is cause enough for Matt to hope that his relationship with Kate can be fulfilled. Matt and Kate together, despite presumably having so many people root against them, actually have a select group of people who recognize their relationship and approve, or at least don't oppose it. Of the people that join them on their expedition, Evelyn Carr recognizes their closeness from the first moment they meet. In their first meeting, what seemed like an indulgence for Carr to play photographer is also a chance for Matt to indulge his fantasy that may become reality, marrying Kate. On the space expedition, Matt eventually confides in Tobias his closeness with Kate, but by story's end, Matt and Kate realize their attempt at keeping their relationship secret was a complete failure, as not only did everyone else see their connection, it was painfully obvious. Apart from Kate's parents and members of their social circle, and Matt's inferiority complex, what's really standing between Matt and Kate in this story is their differing ideas of being free and fulfilled. Matt wants to be free of his seeming deficiency in wealth, status, and maturity so that he may continue building his life with Kate. While he may not have considered marriage at the start, to Matt, marriage to Kate is a natural milestone for their relationship, and the prospect of losing her to marriage to someone else weighs heavily on him. Kate wants to be free of society's expectations of her gender so she can fulfill her desire to make scientific discoveries, and indeed to do so with Matt, despite his insecurities. Where they butt heads is the commitment that leads to marriage. Matt wants to go all the way with Kate, but Kate sees that road as leading to oppression, based solely on tradition, and one she would gladly reject, given her experience being restricted in her choices in the name of tradition. So Kate, at first, openly rejects the milestone that Matt would seek to validate their relationship, setting the romantic tension for the adventure. As the long preparation for the space expedition gets underway, Matt encounters a variety of characters in the meantime, including what I think is most pertinent, someone who exemplified the kind of person Matt himself thinks he ought to be, Captain Chuck Shepard. In the style of media portraying American Air Force pilots in space missions, Shepard seems to be a man with the right stuff. With inspiration from popular portrayal of military heroes, Shepard is written as disciplined, with wide-ranging competence, if his performance in training is anything to go by, and unquestioningly authoritative, a natural choice for crewing the first flight to orbit. While Matt finds himself short in comparison to Shepard, both in seeming maturity and competence, it isn't until later in the story that we get a couple of conspicuous details that run counter to Shepard's placid facade. He has a medical condition, migraines, that act up without warning, and can debilitate him, such as during the journey in space. And he has a fiancée. What makes this conspicuous is that Matt and the reader get no indication that Shepard's relationship with his wife-to-be had any bearing on his outlook on life, the world, his job as Air Force ornithopter test pilot, or his prospect of becoming part of the first launch into space. Compared to Matt, and how his wish to fly as high as possible is deeply connected to his love for Kate, Shepard's involvement in flying apparently doesn't extend beyond serving the military aims of Canada's Air Force, before he is inevitably reduced from flight status for medical reasons. No matter how much Matt may have wished to be like Shepard in the past, Shepard can only be a shadow of Matt in this story. In a similar vein, Evelyn Carr seems to represent the kind of life that Kate would want, free from society's and her family's demand to marry and become an accessory to a husband. Evelyn Carr explicitly uses her success as photographer and journalist to support her independent living, especially away from more privileged and judgmental social circles. As ideal as this would seem to someone like Kate, Carr herself eventually opens up about the circumstance of her solitary existence. When Carr decided not to marry, it was after trouble, in her words, withholding love where it was wanted and giving it where it was not. So she rejected love after rejecting marriage as little better than slavery, for want of a soulmate. In a way, Carr is a shadow of what Kate may become if she rejects marriage to her soulmate. Just as Carr turned to companionship in a monkey named Haiku, we can imagine Kate left in a similar position, although maybe with Phoebe the Aerozoan instead. Since we learn at story's end that Carr knew Kate was close to Matt from the start, we can look back and see she was playing along with Kate and Matt's play acting, when Kate was pretending to want engagement with Sanderson, and probably trying to subtly tell Kate that marriage can be worthwhile when your partner is one you value and trust intimately. Matt, having seen the message Sanderson left for Kate, promising her freedom in their marriage, and heard Carr open up to the group about love and marriage, attempts to reconcile with Kate and find assurance that they'll make their future together. At that point in the story, Kate still isn't ready to concede that her marriage to Matt would still allow her to be herself with Matt, as she had since they first met. It takes a bit more peril, a triumph in the voyage to Tether's End, a wondrous encounter with literally star-crossed lovers in the space whale Etherians, and nearly dying in the return to Earth, does Kate finally decide to commit to marriage with Matt, come what may from their future. But, of course, before Matt and Kate can get married, they have to go to space. As to why they go to space is a pretty interesting question by itself. Arguably, the race to space was set up long before Matt and Kate's involvement, or even their first meeting, because Lunardi specifically stated that constructing the StarClimber and its requisite facilities and support has taken over 2 years, basically around the time Matt and Kate took their first voyage together, including their short-lived companionship with his son, Bruce, and the deadly encounter with pirate Spearglass. The research and development of the astral cable and the rockets to take it up have very likely been going on for longer. Apart from the appeal of big things happening in the background of past stories, it begs questions about why national governments like France or Canada would have a great interest in reaching orbit. Individuals can have a variety of reasons for going to space. The glamour of pioneering a new form of transport and travel, the romance of traveling above the sky to the stars as a stepping stone to other worlds, and the wonder of witnessing the vast, ineffable totality of creation that is our universe. The limitation that individuals have is that reaching space, and staying in orbit, is not something that can be done on individual initiative. Unlike, say, braving an unknown wilderness to blaze a trail, or braving an uncrossed sea to find a new land, going to space takes far, far more than what can be done on the scale of individuals, or even small groups of individuals. To go to space takes vast amounts of energy, material, labor, protection, planning, and other forms of investment in general, not to mention risk from failure, something that has so far required the impetus and the groundwork laid by whole societies, government. So why would a government like Canada or France in Kenneth Opel's airborne world, or those in our world, like the United States, Russia, the member states of the European Space Agency, Japan, China, India, and many others, want to send stuff and people into outer space? In the fiction, France and presumably Canada want to continue what we might call their age of exploration, both over the Earth and beyond Earth, given the references to fanciful depictions of landscapes on the Moon and other planets, meant to gain popular support for their programs. They were also touting their space programs as projects for national pride, something for which their citizens can strive to be the first, and bring prestige to themselves and their nation. In real life, one can say that the space race as we know it started with Russia launching a spherical radio transmitter on top of a rocket into orbit, Sputnik. The technology to allow this feat had been decades in the making, but this would be the first man-made object to orbit the Earth. As far as America was concerned, this feat would be taken as prelude to a communist military deployment of nuclear weapons to space. Naturally, America couldn't let communist Russia have a monopoly on space development, so the race was on. What started as an outgrowth of the beginning Cold War, and the race for making intercontinental ballistic missiles, blossomed into international competition for getting objects and people into space. Milestones to accomplish by going into space included, but were not limited to, getting an object into orbit, getting a living thing into orbit, getting a human into orbit and home safely, getting multiple people into orbit and home safely, getting multiple people in more than one spacecraft into orbit at once, and then getting them to dock in mid-orbit, or exiting their spacecraft to perform spacewalks, then to perform work outside their spacecraft while in orbit, and also, as an aside, deploying various satellites into orbit. Notwithstanding everything that's needed still on the ground to support the missions in space, it's the satellites in space that were and are most useful for a variety of purposes. Given an ability to transmit information over sufficient distance from the ground to the satellite in orbit, whatever the satellite sees or hears from orbit can be recorded down and transmitted back to Earth when remotely commanded to do so. Such is called an Earth observation satellite or reconnaissance satellite. A satellite with power and transmitter can act as a beacon for navigation, given the proper equipment for receiving close to Earth. With yet more advanced electrical equipment and transmitter power, a satellite can receive signals from Earth and relay them to a different part of Earth that would normally be out of radio range, given the Earth's curvature. Other satellites in orbit, instead of facing Earth, can look outward as telescopes to have an unobstructed view of the cosmos, and help advance our knowledge of planetary and stellar bodies and their motions. So what would the Canadian and French governments hope to get out of reaching orbit in Kenneth Opel's story? At no point did they deploy and make use of freely orbiting satellites. Indeed, their ability to use rockets to launch payloads into orbit is relatively new, although advanced enough to apparently rival real-life rockets in a scale similar to the American Saturn V rocket or the Soviet N-1 launch vehicle, or even the conceived but unbuilt Sea Dragon water-based rocket. Also, we have no indication that anyone in story has the massive telecommunications equipment needed to transmit information the long distances needed to control satellites and payloads in orbit, as well as receive information in turn. We can guess then that whatever these fictional counterpart nations want to do in space, they will have to do what they can exclusively with crewed vessels. Airships won't work in the vacuum of outer space, because, as we know now, but the characters only just discover, there's no fluid medium from which to derive buoyancy. Literally everything is denser than a pure vacuum. Also, there's no fluid medium on which to exert the equivalent of aerodynamic flight control. Without other ways to stay in orbit, or to maintain some control in flight, going up to space means coming back down in a virtually uncontrolled freefall. This may be fine for dropping static, uncrewed payloads from, say, an astral cable or celestial tower to a range of given points on Earth, but not for making any explorative trips to other moons or planets. Before developing spacecraft that can control their flight in the vacuum of space, basically what Canada and France in story can use their space programs for is to exploit another way of getting from one part of the Earth to the other in a faster way that could be independent of more earthly concerns, say weather and perhaps national borders. I surmised in my past supplementals of the Airborne trilogy that this world of airships is still a world dominated by imperial competition and expansion. I also surmised that there wasn't a United States, but alas, there are explicitly named Americans in this story, and they're distinct from Canadians, so America exists. Alas, the writing doesn't explicitly tell of their relationship to Canada or to the British Empire in general. Since their journey to space is also dedicated to the King, a la the King of England, we can presume that Canada is still a Commonwealth partner in the Empire. The point is that with the competition for imperial expansion still going on, France and Canada could very well be trying to establish colonies and trade routes to new lands and people that may essentially be blocked off by conventional means, by which I mean airship travel across international borders. There's certainly evidence that imperial expansion is a major motivator for space exploration, and it's easiest to see at story's beginning with Matt and his crew on the Aerocrane Atlas, working on France's Celestial Tower. It's explicitly written that France was employing tens of thousands of people from around the world to construct the tower. It would be no stretch of the imagination to surmise that France was drawing from the labor pools of all the colonies and vassal nations of its own empire in order to build the tower. We have a real-life point of reference for this kind of endeavor, especially in modern times. The Arab states of the Persian Gulf, whose wealth is based on the mass export of oil, both crude and refined, currently use that wealth to import labor and build up their infrastructure in national programs to diversify their economies, lest a change in petroleum commodity prices cause unstable changes in their society. Just like France did in this story, the labor is imported from abroad, notably from India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, and Egypt. In our history, the treatment of migrant workers in these Arab petrostates, especially their exploitation and mistreatment, is a major concern we're still dealing with today. In Opel's airborne world, it's just as likely that France is using labor from across its empire, and just as likely abusing them, given their apparent arrogant disdain for anyone non-French. The most distinct French characters we get to meet in story are one French park attendant, who chooses to be tyrannical over park chits, a French ambassador to Canada who leaves in outrage when Canada's space program is announced, and a Babylite, Christophe, who plays the role of patriotic Frenchman upholding the Celestial Tower's mission, only to reveal his treachery when trying to bring it down via bombing. When Matt foils the plot, French security at least finds the truth of his account and properly congratulates him, before ordering him to keep his mouth shut. We should wonder what would be more embarrassing, that a group of Frenchmen turned Babylite to topple France's national pride in the tower, or that non-Frenchmen were the ones to save the tower from destruction. If past stories are anything to go by, it doesn't seem the French gendarmerie have a good track record of stopping pirate, mercenary, or terrorist activity. France's mission to continue an age of exploration via the Celestial Tower, and the launching of vessels from it to around the world, and even to other worlds, can actually be related in certain ways to the kind of exploration that would interest an industrialist like Lunardi and a Babylite like Christophe. I found the introduction of the Babylites and their movement opposing the space programs of either France or Canada to be a little bizarre. If they decided going upward was somehow an affront to God, as in the biblical story, why should they pop up now as opposed to any point in the past when airships and flying came into widespread use? Even the construction of skyscrapers, which are explicitly mentioned as a feature of Lionsgate City, would fall victim to that viewpoint. Given how the French are portrayed as having a superiority complex, I find it harder to believe that any number large enough to threaten security would have developed an anxiety of angering God, especially when flying high in airships and ornithopters produced no such conundrum before, and have been compelled to start attacking those high-altitude construction projects. It would make sense if the Babylites weren't Frenchmen. That is, if they were the underclass of France's colonies, made to labor for the wealth of French high society, with little profit to themselves, and would now want to strike back against another imperial project meant to subjugate more people under the dominance of France. Alas, all the Babylites we see in story are explicitly Frenchmen, or not explicitly indigenous members of colonized peoples. My personal guess is the Babylonites came about from disgruntlement at the amount of migrant labor imported to construct such a monumental undertaking that, in their mind, should rightly be an exclusively French undertaking. Never mind it's the brainchild of the French government and the elite of French society, likely sponsoring the construction, and never mind that it should be a validation of the French system of imperialism, supposing that the goal of imperial expansion was indeed correct on my part. Alas, apart from an outside threat giving a new internal challenge to our characters going to space, that's the best I can figure on the significance of an oppositional movement such as the Babylonites. Lunardi's involvement in the space program also presents its own unique but familiar dynamic. As well established, Lunardi is a prominent business owner who makes his wealth from the commissioned construction, sale, and operation of airships. The fact that Lunardi's enterprise constructed the first spacefaring vessel is a particular divergence from our real historical spacefaring efforts. For one thing, sending up rockets with payloads into orbit just wasn't and couldn't be profitable for any private business venture until decades of risk-taking research and development was completed. Only with a substantial body of knowledge concerning rocket space launch, spaceflight, human medical experience from orbital flight, as well as experience with remote payload control and ground support, could a private venture benefit from any profitable opportunities presented. Just for perspective, decades after Sputnik launched into space and the space race had run its course, only relatively recently have private enterprises invested in services reaching into space. For someone like Lunardi to assume such great risk in the first space launch should indicate that he's expecting some profit from the production of spaceships and space launches, likely under government contract, because otherwise, he's not likely to be digging up gold from space for a long while yet. As a point of reference, much of the value from real-life spaceflight comes from private and commercial telecommunications and remote sensing satellites, the products of which are widely used by both businesses and government services, as well as the commercial utilization of the technologies used to achieve spaceflight, from both remote satellites and crewed spaceflights. Without the utilization of orbital space via remote-controlled satellites, a private businessman like Lunardi would have to wait for crewed spaceflights to make landfall on celestial bodies, to essentially go prospecting for extracting resources, and hopefully bringing them back. Given how great an investment this would be for us in real life, given our more technically advanced spaceflight abilities, for Lunardi it would be an even greater investment and a longer wait for any profitable returns. Unless there are more numerous comets and asteroids that are reachable given the portrayed launch vehicle technology, then leaving spaceflight development as a largely or equally private enterprise, even in such a lucratively wealthy partner like Lunardi, will still leave a long wait for profits to come back. That's comparing the fantasy to our real-world history, science, technology, and economics thereof. But the fantasy does offer an alternative, maybe slightly unorthodox, resource for exploitation: the spaceborne life itself. Throughout the StarClimber's climb to geosynchronous orbit, they encounter space rocks that are the eggs of the Etherians, i.e. space whales, essentially which are covered in minerals and microscopic life, which hatch into juvenile Etherians, and on the way back, a crystalline kind of coral or plant life and barnacles on their tether, for lack of a better classification. I don't think anyone should be surprised if Lunardi and company decided to go try fishing and whaling in space for anything of value to bring back to rich buyers. Chef Vlad's idea to cook the Etherian newborn, like some kind of fish dish, might be just the kind of thing that catches on. You might notice, for the story itself and the concept in general, getting to space is half the fun. The story starts with portraying a method of reaching space that we, with the benefit of extensive hindsight, can reasonably call foolhardy. A really, really, really tall tower, built on the compressive strength of its frame and the materials composed thereof. Like all things demanding high strength and light weight, the tower relies on alumiron, made into frames, pillars, piers, struts, and girders. If it helps, imagine the Eiffel Tower's construction, but greatly expanded and upscaled to try and reach outer space. Of the numerous problems with trying to reach space by building a building from the ground up, is that without an exponentially greater and greater size foundation, and without a more pyramidal structure, any tower reaching up so high and made just a little too slender will suffer such high forces and stresses that any vertical compression supporting member or frame will buckle under the load, even before the material itself structurally fails, and the tower will topple, just like the Celestial Tower does in story. The world of Airborne and our world don't have physics and material sciences different enough to make up the difference. In both, there are no materials that can support the mass of a tower going to space without a corresponding foundation or foundations covering a substantial amount of real estate. Making the Great Pyramids look like an afternoon garden project would be an astronomical understatement. So, we don't build towers to space. Yet. There are alternative methods of building that could theoretically work, given enough time, research, and interest, if one is willing to think beyond compression support columns. One theoretical method is called a space fountain, which takes a stream of particles and uses substantial, consistent, and reliable power to give them such momentum that they can be directed upwards in a tube toward the underside of a platform, or a 180-degree turn in the tube. The momentum of the particles gets imparted to the platform or loop, supporting it against gravity, while the particle stream returns to Earth to be re-energized and redirected back upward again. The force of the particle stream supporting the platform might theoretically raise the height limit of the building up to low Earth orbit, and anything that can be taken up that tower can then be accelerated into orbit via more rocket means, without the drag of the atmosphere slowing it down. For the cost of a large amount of power, contingencies for that power failure, and the need for rockets still, a space-bound payload, like a vessel, can be launched with less energy than a ground-starting rocket launch. Also, now there is a tower that can be as useful as any other high-rise building. Another concept, and one I particularly like, is called space shaft, and it doesn't use power or compressive strength, but buoyancy. Imagine a conventional tower, but divided into levels, each level suspended by envelopes of lifting gas. With enough gas, and the ability of the envelopes to expand with altitude, stacking sections increases the lifting capacity of the whole, until, theoretically, the top of the tower reaches close to the vacuum of space, where any payload or spacecraft that can be brought up can then rocket into orbit much easier. Personally, I figured this would fit Kenneth Opel's airborne world better than what is essentially an enlarged Eiffel Tower. And it wouldn't be too different from the space elevator presented via the StarClimber in story. I always like to imagine that a buoyant space shaft and space elevator would naturally complement each other, the shaft protecting the tether while in atmosphere. As for rocket launch, which is more conventional to us, the intricacies of a predictable and controlled rocket flight into orbit are mostly glossed over, as far as the needs of the story are concerned. But in reality, as rockets are the only way we have ever gone to space, understanding how to engineer rockets and predict or control their flight is of the utmost importance. As stated rather simply in story, the iterations of rockets tested simply fell back to Earth or blew up, but in time got longer and longer flight times until finally they stopped coming down. Based on real-life physics and the operating principles of rockets, that should mean that the rocket gained enough height above the atmosphere and enough horizontal velocity to achieve orbit, thus falling around the Earth. The in-story falsehood is that any rocket or satellite payload goes into orbit by going straight up and gaining enough height from Earth. Nothing stays in orbit from lack of gravity, as it's gravity that allows anything to stay in orbit. It's the speed of an object perpendicular to gravity that allows spaceflight as we know it. Going straight up wouldn't put the rocket into orbit at any point beneath geosynchronous orbit, because the horizontal velocity of the Earth's surface rotation is much lower. The reality is that rocket propulsion to orbit requires a flight profile that curves horizontally until the combination of height gained and speed gained puts the rockets into orbit. The story's implication that the rocket went straight up and paid out its astral cable payload behind it as it went can only be fantasy. The process for deploying the cable would be far more complex, as we'll discuss later. Rockets achieve orbit by expending a large volume of their mass as fuel, as well as shedding the excess weight of empty stages. Before launch, a rocket's mass is typically 80 to 90% fuel, even more when trying to reach higher orbits, which requires that the rocket carrying the payload in its structure must in its totality be much larger than the payload. The rocket counterweight in story is implicitly a single-stage rocket, certainly very large, but still, if it were real, much less likely to reach orbit, much less geosynchronous orbit, because without jettisoning excess weight, the rocket burn couldn't keep up the acceleration needed to make orbital speed before being expended. This is relevant in story because for 2 months before StarClimber's climb, the rocket counterweight was not at the proper altitude to maintain orbit with the mass of the StarClimber added onto it. Contrary to what the characters thought in story, their weightlessness did not make them massless. The space elevator system depends on the center of mass between counterweight and payload remaining at or above geosynchronous orbit. When the rocket counterweight failed to reach the proper height, and the StarClimber started going up, the center of mass likely drifted below geosynchronous orbit, causing the crisis that necessitates a mad dash to the counterweight and the rocket's reignition to the proper height. This brings us to how a space elevator system works, as it's the central feature of the story. It's the track to the stars that the titular vessel, StarClimber, climbs up. There's no real-life working space elevator system, but there is a fair amount of theory worked out, and more than a little testing done on smaller analogs of the systems required. Its most simplified form is described as so. A counterweight in space is tethered to a planet's surface by a line under tension. The counterweight is above geosynchronous orbit by a distance inversely proportional to its mass, which is greater than the line or any payload below the line. To visualize, the counterweight could be as simple as a length of line equal to the line below geosynchronous orbit, or perhaps more practically, the line deploying spacecraft itself, which would be many times more massive than the line, and thus could be much closer to the geosynchronous orbit point. To increase the capacity and safety of the line after deployment, multiple further climbers would add layers to the line until it was strong enough and safe enough to hold payloads going to space, including perhaps a sturdy crewed vessel like StarClimber. The line itself, the key to the system, would be the most important part to be designed, without which the rest of the space elevator would be rendered unfeasible. The material described in story would qualify simply as unobtainium, as it is only important that it is a material that simply meets the requirements of the engineering needed to make the space elevator possible. A real-life material far and away more likely to meet the needs of the space elevator is a substance called carbon nanotubes, cylindrical bundles of carbon atoms attached to each other in a hexagonal pattern, akin to sheets of carbon graphite, pencil lead. Compared to steel wire, it is 1/6 the density and over 30 times the tensile strength per unit area cross-section. Even in the likely event that carbon nanotubes cannot be drawn, spun, and wound to such great lengths by themselves, composite construction that attaches lengths of nanotube together to make up the distance to orbit would still theoretically make payload delivery to space feasible on a ribbon no bigger than one's hand. Depending on ribbon design, the line could support payloads useful for space missions, while still being durable enough to survive damage until repairs can be done. After all, as far as we know, there's no space barnacles that secrete metal-dissolving acids to threaten it. Getting into space, however, is a whole other rocket-powered endeavor. Whether taken up on a launch vehicle all at once, or in pieces to be assembled in space, the initial spacecraft has a very specific mission to deploy the line from space. Using onboard fuel and likely rocket thrust, if not more efficient ion engine thrust, the spacecraft has to reach geosync orbit over the spot on Earth where a launch facility would send up climbers. The craft would then start lowering the line using a device to drag down the line, and either counter the line's twisting or else count the line's twists in transit for ground-based untwisting. At the same time, the spacecraft would raise its own altitude to keep the center of mass at geosynchronous height. As the line descended and the craft ascended, both ends would have to compensate for angular acceleration. For as the whole assembly orbits around Earth, the tendency will be for the whole thing to rotate relative to Earth, forming the basis not of a space elevator, but a skyhook, which is an entirely different principle and construct. Until gravity is strong enough to pull down on line's end and hold it vertical, the device holding at line's end and the spacecraft will need to use precise thrust to keep orientation vertical. After some time of precise control, the line's end should eventually reach Earth's surface, and when caught and secured, the spacecraft should continue paying out the line to its end to make best use of the counterweight's mass to hold the line up. This brings up an important component for the system to function: power. In story, StarClimber is powered directly from the metallic astral cable, akin to a typical electrical transmission line. While that would be a useful double function of a space elevator's ribbon, being both structurally redundant and electrically conductive enough over tens of thousands of kilometers would require excessive engineering. In real life, electrical transmission minimizes losses to electrical resistance and heat by utilizing alternating current. But there are still measurable losses in power over the comparatively short distances on Earth. Going to space relying on alternating current to reach 25,000 miles would require overcoming a great deal of power losses to heat. Even if the line had the best conductivity as silver does, the losses would still be excessive. That's why most theoretical designs for spacecraft and climbers going up the cable use beamed power. With a ground-based laser transmitter and photovoltaic solar cells on the climber, power is carried in light to make electricity to power a climber's ascent. This is far and away beyond the technology of Opel's airborne world to utilize, but it's a viable option for us should we undertake making our own space elevator. As for making a trip to space up the line, it would be wise to send up numerous climbers carrying spools of carbon nanotube ribbon to attach to the existing line and reinforce it to a specification suitable for a crewed vehicle akin to StarClimber. These climbers would be simple, modular, and expandable to adapt to the growing line and the differing requirements for that line at different altitudes. At line's end, where the initial spacecraft is left, the climbers would add their mass to the counterweight. When the time comes to launch a crewed vessel up the line, if real-life crewed spacecraft are any guide, they won't be of such heavy construction as implied in story, and certainly won't be furnished like a high-end hotel stateroom. Going to space in a pressurized vessel meant to sustain human life would necessitate building as small and compactly as possible, as a larger surface area for a given pressure demands greater strength and thus more weight. Our real-life StarClimber's insides would more closely resemble a module or modules from the International Space Station than anything as aesthetically pleasing as Victorian fashion demands. It certainly wouldn't help in the quest for spaceborne life when Earth-borne microbes and contaminants are free and frequent, when space rocks are retrieved and brought aboard. It's why our real-life space exploration missions require our payloads to be constructed and assembled in clean rooms, and assembled such that nothing of Earth is brought to space to give a false positive, even when seeking alien life isn't the goal. Just as an amusing side note, when the crew is weightless in space, there should be still shenanigans every time the StarClimber accelerated, both up and down. Anyone not strapped in or sticking with magnetic overshoes would be bouncing off the floor and ceiling, and in a wholly undignified manner. But alas, that will have to be left to our imagination. There are many more considerations for the design of a theoretical space elevator system, and many more uses to consider for such a system as well. I would posit in no uncertain terms that such a system would greatly expand our capacity to reach space and the worlds beyond. The pictures seen here come from a book by Bradley C. Edwards, Ph.D., that has largely informed my knowledge of the concept. Back when I first read StarClimber, it was the most comprehensive bit of literature I could find about the theoretical space elevator, and I hope you might find it a compelling read as well, if space exploration and its possibilities interest you. Of course, the StarClimber is not the point of the story. The story is much more about Matt and Kate, and the crew that make the perilous journey to space, and all that help or hinder them, that which is often of their own making. In training, Matt does his best to prove himself worthy of being chosen to make the expedition, out of so many other candidates. In Matt's eyes, everyone else seems to have one or more advantages, not least their age and presumed experience. Even comparing himself to his relative peer in Tobias, Matt is fighting to show himself equal to this massive endeavor, given its presumed significance. But in trying to best so many other people, it takes Matt a long time to realize the fact that he cannot go to space alone, that he cannot be the best alone, and that he must make a team with others to do so. He gets along with Tobias well enough, and marvels at his friend's skill and ease in weightlessness, and even makes headway forming a kind of team with others towards trial's end. The ease and security with which Tobias and Matt work together becomes vital to their success and safety throughout the journey to space. Matt's candidacy is opposed both competitively and philosophically by the Aeroforce test pilots Bronfman and Shepard. These two exemplify the idea that to be the best is to be so individually and independently, that to rely on others makes one a lesser candidate, especially for such a risky endeavor as the first ever spaceflight. This is expected of the test pilots, as by nature of their profession, flying alone in their ornithopters, they are, by definition, the only ones that can assure their survival in the air. As good as Shepard is concerning all the trials, what the trials do not explicitly demand is that the candidates not only succeed, but also succeed together, as they will have to survive space together. This comes up in the operation to save the StarClimber and themselves from a deorbiting counterweight. During preparations, Shepard, despite putting on airs of being professional, does not offer his trust to his crewmates in Matt and Tobias, and regularly doubts Captain Walken's conviction and confidence in the same. His effect on Matt is such that offering to help is instinctively taken as an insult, and results in a perilous outburst that endangers both Shepard and the mission. It isn't until he's laid low by his own medical condition, and Captain Walken and Matt Cruz save the rocket and StarClimber, only then does Shepard start to understand and trust in Matt's contribution to the mission. Unfortunately, on the way home, Shepard dies before he and Matt can establish trust as a team. Unlike Shepard's discouraging aloofness and lacking commitment to the others, a team is forged in Matt and Tobias thanks to the venerable Captain Walken. Having shepherded Matt and crew of the Aurora for years, clearly Walken has distinguished himself enough that he is chosen for the first spaceflight and for choosing the crew to lead it. Indeed, I should expect that during the trials, Walken wasn't looking for the best candidates by themselves, but also those that work best together. Being an unwavering supporter of his subordinates means that when everything goes wrong, and everybody on StarClimber is in their greatest danger, and when Walken is incapacitated during the harrowing return to Earth, Matt and Tobias, as well as Kate and Dr. Turgenev, form the functional crew to see them all safely home against all odds. Kate herself, while not directly responsible for StarClimber's journey and the mission's progress, nevertheless proves herself as more than just a passive passenger. When not investigating the astral life forms they encounter, she's just as motivated in being proactive when challenges arise. Really, just like she always has in both her previous adventures with Matt Cruz. While people like Snuffler will act out in indignity and despair, or like Carr will withdraw into stoic detachment, Kate steps up to act with the crew in their efforts. Throughout his adventures, we have seen Matt Cruz time and again attempt to prove himself as equal to others, those he respects and those he envies, equal in abilities and in trust. In many ways, Matt's journey aboard StarClimber is a culmination of all he's had to learn since he first met Kate 2 years prior. From a daring midair rescue of a doomed balloon, to a safe spacecraft balloon landing, from a humble, capable cabin boy to one of the first astronauts, Matt has come to understand that he has the right stuff. And not while alone, but always with the people he's met and come to trust. The Aurora's crew, Captain Walken, and later Bruce, Nadira, and Sagarmatha's Sherpa crew, then Tobias and Dr. Turgenev, and always, there's Kate. By story's end, both Kate and Matt have finally openly committed to staying together and always seeking each other out on whatever further adventure awaits them. I'd like to think that Matt best honors his father in this way, not simply flying forever, but to fly forever with everyone he trusts and loves. So that is the journey of Matt and Kate in 3 books. I'd like to imagine what new adventures and shenanigans they'd get up to after book's end. Matt and Kate would have to meet her parents and quell their surprise and disappointment. And Matt will have to get back to graduating from the Airship Academy, starting to make a living as an airship officer, while Kate will have to make it back to Paris with Matt to finish her studies and continue making expeditions to expand her zoological work. Sounds like a tough balancing act, but hey, if this fantastic world can support airships and space elevators and space life the way our world never has, I think Matt and Kate can make it work.